All right. Fantastic. And now I will let everyone in.
Yes. Did you get a message from me earlier today?
I did. And I'm actually, by coincidence, I am already looking at that for your class and some other things. So I will send you some information.
Thank you. All right.
Of course.
Good evening, everybody. Hello.
Good evening.
Thank you. That's the Transylvania contingent.
Well, do you know?
Jen. Hi. It's me, Suzanne.
So it happens when you're alone too long and your family leaves town, you start freaking out and talking to
I
the cat.
see. Well, I'm glad you're very relaxed about it, Nick. Yeah.
I'm trying.
Okay. Good. Good evening, everybody else. Ann, Sharon, Suzanne. Okay. So, anybody have any questions before we get rolling? Any of the material we covered last week or in previous weeks? Anything at all about the Bible? That's a pretty open-ended question.
I have one for you.
Please.
Why is the book of Maccabees not in the Hebrew scriptures as far as it's normally considered these days in the Tanakh?
Yes, it's a great question. And I'll give you what I think is the answer. There are people who know more about that stuff than I do, but this is just my own suspicion. And that is the rabbis did not want to glorify the Maccabees. They knew that they weren't going to win against Rome, and they didn't want to give more encouragement to the people who wanted to fight Rome. We're going to talk about that a little later tonight, because, you know, now that we're done with the Bible, now we have to get to some of the gruesome parts of Jewish history, which is the century and a half after the Bible. So, you know, really after the Romans come to town. You know, the Romans were the most powerful force on earth, and you didn't fool with them. You couldn't kick them out. You could think you kicked them out, but they would just come back with a bigger army.
But if you
So,
did
in this
succeed,
situation, they didn't want, the rabbis did not want to encourage people to think that, oh, we should have more Maccabees fighting against the Romans. You know, the Maccabees were great in their time and place. The Zealots who fought the Romans, that was something else. And we'll get to that later tonight, hopefully. Other questions? Yes, Ann.
there were other things that were problematic about the Maccabees.
Well, sure. I mean, the leadership of the Maccabees after the Maccabean War was nothing to be proud of. You know, they were great in war and they were terrible in peace. We talked about that last week. They're just, you know, the rabbis certainly didn't want to pull that out as an example. However, I think the biggest reason is the one I mentioned. The other may have played a part. My opinion. Other questions?
Can we cover everything in the rabbis tonight?
No, sorry. Yeah, we just can't. But what I'm going to try and do is cover a very busy period, which was the next century and a half. Okay? And that'll get us started into rabbinic Judaism. So, yeah, I mentioned last week that in 63, before the Common Era, remember the 60s? Right. 63 before the Common Era, a civil war breaks out between two Maccabee descendants, brothers. And they decide to ask the Romans, who are busy pillaging in Syria, to adjudicate between them. And they end up with one of them being the puppet king for the Romans. The Romans occupied Jerusalem. The Romans have a presence throughout the land. So now, a century after they drove out Antiochus, the Romans are in charge, and the new king's main job is collecting tribute for the Romans. Nonetheless, Judaism continues to develop because there are sages and there are scribes who are dedicated to preserving and passing on and interpreting the laws of the Torah as they understood them. So there developed during this period an institution called the Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin is a Jewish court. There is the Great Sanhedrin, which had 71 members, which met in the temple in Jerusalem. And there were smaller courts, also referred to as Sanhedrin, that functioned in virtually every community. Some very important differences between Jewish law as it functioned in that time and other systems of law. The Great Sanhedrin was the only court that could deal with capital cases. As Telushka notes, the head of the Sanhedrin would appoint different members to deal with both sides of the case. Unlike a district attorney today, they didn't have a vested interest in getting a lot of convictions. The goal was not to put people in prison or to kill people. It was to find out what justice was appropriate, right? They wanted to protect the innocent, and they knew that someone wasn't guilty just because they were accused. To convict someone in the Great Sanhedrin, you needed 37 votes, a majority plus one. If, however, all 71 members of the Sanhedrin voted to convict, the accused would go free because they felt it was too likely that the fix was in. And nobody really tried to make a case to exonerate the accused. Plus, when they would vote, each one would have to vote individually, and they voted one at a time. The youngest member of the Sanhedrin would go first, so that they would not just listen to the elders and follow whatever they did. To be on the Great Sanhedrin, you had to have a number of qualifications. You had to be versed both in Torah and in certain branches of secular learning, such as math and medicine. You had to know several languages. Why? Because they wanted to limit reliance on interpreters, which normally would have been very important in courts in that time and place. You also had to be married and have children, because being a parent, as all of us parents know, is a humbling experience, right? And judges should be humble. And yes, they had to be men. That was a given 2,000 years ago. Sorry about that. Maimonides later codified 7 qualifications to be such a judge: wisdom, humility, fear of God, hatred of anything gained illegally, love of truth, love of other people, and a good reputation. So if you had all of those things, you probably were pretty well qualified to be in the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin met in Jerusalem until it was destroyed in 70 of the Common Era. And then it moved to a little village called Yavne, which we'll talk about later on tonight when we get to the events of 70. The Sanhedrin lasted in different places until sometime in the early 5th century, when things became just totally intolerable for Jews in the land of Israel. Okay, comments or questions up to here? Okay.
Well, I'm sorry, it took me
Yeah.
a second. I'm shocked at how difficult it was to get a job. For these guys, that's quite a list of requirements. You definitely couldn't have someone on there just because he was, Bobo's cousin or something.
Yeah, yeah. And there was no Judge Judy in that period. Yeah, you had to have a whole lot of qualifications, and not that many people lived up to it.
He does.
Yeah, thanks. But still, the other thing you have to remember, Nick, is that if you were a judge in the Sanhedrin, that was not your full-time job.
That was your part-time gig?
It was a very part-time gig, and you didn't necessarily get a salary for it.
Well, that's
Right?
probably a good thing in a sense. I mean, if judges weren't paid for it or they weren't elected, and of course, then you'd have to be careful who's selecting them.
Yes.
But that's probably a good thing.
I can't tell you about today. Yes, Suzanne. You have to unmute, Suzanne. You still, here you go.
There we go. I find it interesting that if everybody voted to convict the individual, I mean, was thrown out and they were let go.
Yeah.
What if the person was really guilty? That means at least one member of the Sanhedrin had to vote against conviction. And I don't understand. I know what you said, but I don't quite understand what would happen when someone was truly guilty and everyone thought so.
Well, the feeling is that even if someone is truly guilty, there has to be somebody who will at least make a case for them. It might not be the best case, right? But, in our system of law, even evil people get lawyers.
I was going to say, yeah. From what you just said, it's like your defense lawyer.
Yeah, you're entitled to a defense lawyer. You're entitled to have somebody who sticks up for you. I don't think they were too worried about this, that somebody would get off. If somebody is really evil, don't worry, a majority will convict them. But if nobody sticks up for them, then something's wrong.
Interesting way of looking at it.
Well, in a way, I think it's akin to our system that provides pro bono lawyers for those who can't afford them, right? And even that lawyer may be convinced that his client is guilty, but he's got to make a case for him, and he's got to believe in it enough to believe that somebody else might believe it.
When you put it that way, and when I think about it being compared to the defense lawyer who can't stand the person they're defending, it makes a bit more sense.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Just one point. Most people don't have pro bono lawyers. They have court-appointed lawyers, especially in criminal cases. And those guys get paid. I mean, they're not making what the top-notch lawyers make. But
they get paid.
Yeah, it's just, for some people, it's how they earn their living. It's, you know, they take on like tons of clients, so they make money, but then they don't do anything for them.
Which
what happens a lot.
It's just not the way the system is supposed to work. You're supposed to have an actual defense lawyer, somebody who defends the client. Yeah, doesn't always work out that way, unfortunately. I don't know what to call the equivalent of the Sanhedrin today. I don't think we have anything quite like it. So back to the 1st century before the Common Era. The king around the last part of that century is Herod. Herod is a bloody ruler, kills off most of his own family along with anyone else that he deems to be a threat to his rule. But he's a busy man in that he does a lot of construction. He expands and beautifies the temple over a 9-year period, rebuilds the walls of Jerusalem. He even creates a new Roman city, the city of Caesarea, which still exists in Israel today. Now it's much more, I mean, you don't find too many things there from that era, although there is a wonderful amphitheater that goes back to the time of Herod. There were two main camps of Jews during this period. They were the Pharisees and the Sadducees. In general, the Sadducees represented the upper classes, the Pharisees not so much the upper classes. Those who wanted to preserve and teach the oral tradition, the oral Torah, they were in the Pharisee camp. What is the oral Torah? Well, it's the theory that when God gave the Torah to Moses, there was also an oral tradition that clarified how some of the laws were to be carried out. Now, there were details that were not included in the Torah itself. One other important difference is that the Pharisees believed in an afterlife and the Sadducees did not. Which sort of figures, since most of the Sadducees were pretty well off and they had already gotten their share in this world. So my attitude in discussing this, we should make fortunes like the Sadducees, but deal with everything as if there were an afterlife. And that's probably why Judaism maintains that belief today. Right? There were a couple of other sects that you may have heard of. There was a group called the Essenes. They were kind of fed up with the way the temple was being run. And so they moved to the desert and they sort of set up their own method of worship. And then there was a group that broke away from them, which became known as the Dead Sea sect. Both of these groups were celibate. Okay? They believed in celibacy. Well, guess what happened to these groups?
They die off.
Guess what? They died off, because, it's just not very practical. Now, like some of the early Christians, they believed that the end of the world is near, right? So who wants to bring children into the end of the world and the apocalypse and so forth? But they were wrong. So they did not last. In this earlier period, there was no such thing as a rabbi. There was no ordination of rabbis. That comes into being in the 1st century of the Common Era. Nevertheless, one of the most famous of the sages, who is often erroneously referred to as a rabbi, lived in this period. He died about the year 10 of the Common Era, and his name was Hillel, right? Everybody's heard of Hillel. Yeah. So Hillel was actually born in Babylonia, but he came to the land of Israel when he was 40 years old, and he immediately, in very short order, he became one of the leading lights in Jewish learning. He had to overcome many difficulties to gain admittance to the school of the sages and to learn together with them. Suffered many hardships while pursuing that aim. So one such famous story tells of how he, he was working a day job and still, trying to study with the sages, you couldn't go into the study house without paying a coin, right? You gave a coin to the doorkeeper. That was your tuition for the day. One day, in the dead of winter, apparently there wasn't much work that day, that week, and Hillel didn't have another coin. So what did he do? In the schoolhouse, the study house, there was a skylight. And he climbed up onto the roof and he tried his best he could to follow the discussion that was going on inside. Meanwhile, it starts to snow. Okay? And so Hillel kind of falls asleep up there. And inside the study house, a couple of people notice that it's much darker inside than usual. And they look up in the skylight. So he says, there's a person up there, right? So they get up there, they haul him off down the roof, they take him inside, they warm him up. From that day on, they didn't worry about charging him admission. At least this is a story that at least demonstrates his commitment to acquiring Jewish wisdom, right? And eventually he rose to become the head of the Sanhedrin, and was recognized as the highest authority among the Pharisees, right? According to the Jerusalem Talmud, Hillel had 80 pairs of disciples. The man at the bottom of the heap, the second guy in the lowest pair, was a fellow by the name of Yochanan ben Zakkai. And if that name's familiar to you, it should be. We'll talk about him a little bit later. But just remember that he was the lowest of the students of Hillel at one time, right? So whatever Hillel's position was, his authority was sufficient to introduce many decrees that were handed down in his name. Many of his teachings are very widely known, although there are a couple of sages from later periods who are also known as Hillel, like, Hillel II and Hillel III. So, some of the sayings that are attributed to Hillel the Elder may actually have come from one of the others. One such episode attributed to him, a prospective convert, or more likely someone who just wanted to mock the sages, came before one of the other sages, a fellow by the name of Shammai, and said, teach me, I'll convert to Judaism if you can teach me the entire Torah while I stand on one foot, right? Well, Shammai was a builder, and he happened to have a builder's stone in his hand. And he threw it at him and drove him away. Said, I'll give you Torah. I'll give you some Torah. But then, the guy got so much fun out of that he went to Hillel and tried the same question. And Hillel said, okay, what is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. That is the whole Torah. All the rest is commentary. Now go and learn. Right? And apparently that was an impressive enough answer to persuade the person actually to convert. Yes, Ann?
What does that mean, on one foot? That's a strange thing to say.
It was a way of making fun of Judaism. It was always, oh, there's so much, there's way too much to learn. And so teach it all to me while I stand on one foot.
Oh, you mean like in a nutshell?
Yeah. Yeah, but only as long as I can stand on one foot. How long can you stand on one foot?
Never mind me.
Depends
Okay.
if I'm leaning against a wall.
Yeah, that's another foot. Okay, so at any rate, this is sometimes referred to as the golden rule of Judaism, but notice that it's in the negative form.
That
It's
makes it
not do
better.
unto others as you would have them do unto you. It is what is hateful to you, do not do to others.
That's good, because they might not like the same thing you do.
Exactly. So, a proverb came about afterwards that a person should always be humble and patient like Hillel and not passionate like Shammai. Another story about Hillel found in the Talmud. Two people made a bet on whether they could get Hillel angry. Right? And they interrupted things that he was doing, and they questioned him, and they made insulting allusions to his Babylonian origin, but they never made him angry. And they said, we lost the bet on account of you. And he said, you should lose your bet and lose twice more. Better that than I should be angry. Right? Be like Hillel. Don't be easily angered. Right? A good quality to have. Hillel also emphasized a person's duty to care for their own body. The Midrash has him saying, as in a theater and circus, the statues of the king must be kept clean by him to whom they have been entrusted. So the bathing of the human body is a duty of man who was created in the image of the Almighty King of the world. Right? And one of the most famous sayings of Hillel, found in Pirkei Avot, said, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? But if I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? Right? So, the third part is really, don't postpone whatever is really important to do. Right? And he gave a similar admonition about Jewish learning. He said, don't say that I will study when I have free time, because you may never have free time. Life doesn't always hand it to you, right? So that's a little bit about Hillel. It's been suggested that we should have bubblegum cards for the great rabbis, just like they have for athletes, right? When I was growing up, collecting cards of baseball players was a big thing, right? Well, maybe we should give out bubblegum cards with pictures of rabbis. Unfortunately, we don't have a picture of Hillel, right? We have no idea what Hillel looked like, except he wasn't particularly handsome. He wasn't a particularly charismatic man. He just happened to be the most learned sage of his age. So a little bit about Hillel. Questions or comments up to here? Okay, so now we come to the period where Christianity began. So I have to say a little bit about that. It's an important period in Jewish history as well. So who was Jesus? Well, we know today that Jesus was a Jew. He had many of the same ethical concerns as the prophets, and similarly never rejected the rest of the Torah. Matthew chapter 5 has Jesus say, "Do not imagine I have come to abolish the law." No part of the law will disappear until its purpose will be achieved. And what was that purpose? The purpose was everyone should recognize and worship the one God. Well, sounds pretty Jewish, right? That he was. Telushkin deals with the question of whether Jesus claimed to be the Messiah. And he kind of hedges on that. I mean, Jesus hedges on that question, much like the seventh Chabad Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson did. Although you have to remember, in Jesus' defense, that Messiah had a different meaning in that time. Next class, we're going to talk about Bar Kokhba, who was kind of a false Messiah, who many people believed that he was the Messiah when he was leading a rebellion against Rome in the 2nd century. It's not, it's not the same kind of thing. Bar Kokhba was a military leader who was going to bring freedom and independence to the Jews. Jesus didn't seem to be interested in the freedom part. He wasn't really stirring up rebellion against the Romans. Right? It's not at all clear that Jesus intended to start a new religion. And Paul, of course, is the real founder of Christianity as a faith. Most of what Jesus teaches fits into the normative Judaism of the day, although Telushkin cites 3 exceptions. Yes, Leon?
Rabbi, I was just wondering, back in that time period, did the Jewish priests accept Jesus as a learned person, or did they push him away?
It's not clear. The Gospels have one narrative, but actually the Gospels have many narratives. So I can't really answer that completely. If Jesus was not one of the most learned sages, then they probably wouldn't have sat him down in the Sanhedrin and, made a spot for him with the other sages. But that doesn't mean they had anything against him. Okay. So Telushkin, has 3 exceptions where what Jesus taught didn't really fit into normative Judaism. Number 1, Jesus forgives all sins. Well, in Judaism, we believe that God only forgives sins committed against God. You can't forgive sins that are committed against somebody else. Right? You don't give a beat down to somebody down the block and then come to me and ask me for forgiveness. Right? Doesn't work like that. Right? Number 2, Jesus said, offer the wicked no resistance. Well, in Judaism, that was never the law. Right? In fact, sometimes the idea is, as in Deuteronomy, burn out the evil from your midst. Or as in the Psalms, those who love the Lord hate evil. Right? Evil has to be countered. Right? As the rabbis later said, if someone comes to you and tries to kill you, get up earlier and kill him first. That's the law, right? And then, and of course, it's, would Jesus have been a pacifist in in the war against the Romans or anything else. If he was, that's, it's hard to say that that's really a Jewish position. There is a space for pacifism in Judaism, but not one that works for Jewish leadership. Exception number 3, Jesus said, people can only come to God through him. Well, that's not what the psalmist says. The psalmist says, God is near to all who call upon him in truth. That's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. And that's good enough for everybody else. The Gospels portray Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, rather favorably, maybe in an attempt to curry favor with the Romans and also to blame the Jews for Jesus' death. Of course, Jews almost never had capital punishment. And when they did, crucifixion was not one of the 4 means utilized for different crimes. It was the Romans who typically crucified Jews. Right? Pelushkin quotes an estimate of 50 to 100,000 Jews who at one time or another were crucified by the Romans. Pilate, from everything else we know about him, was too vicious even for the Romans. They replaced him because they decided at a certain point that he was too authoritarian and he was stirring up the pot, and they didn't want, the Jews to be, to have extra reasons to rebel against the Romans. They wanted a governor who would just collect the tribute and keep things quiet and maintain the Roman presence there. Right? Anne had a comment in an email she sent me that I want to share with you. She says that the Gospels are based more on Paul's preaching than on anything Jesus may actually have said. I expect we scarcely have any info about what Jesus actually said. Well, we don't have firsthand accounts, right? The Gospels are written a little bit later. One of them is written as much as, over 2 generations later. Certainly, Paul modifies what Jesus says and suggests that it emphasizes one cannot possibly fulfill all of the Torah properly. And so for Paul, the only way out of that dilemma is through Christians' faith, which now presto automatically saves someone. So at any rate, we, with all these being much later documents, probably written under Paul's supervision or after his teaching, we don't need to take them too seriously as historical accounts. Paul claims to have grown up as a traditional Jew, as a Pharisee, and then he had some kind of mind-altering experience on the road to Damascus. He has a vision of Jesus as God. And after that, there was a radical shift from people who believed in Jesus as the Messiah, but were part of the Jewish people and the Jewish community, kind of a Jewish sect. And then that changed to being a new religion. In the book of Romans, chapter 3, Paul says, we conclude that a man is put right with God only through faith and not by doing what the law commands. Well, we believe just the opposite, right? And clearly the prophets did too. However critical they were of sacrifices, they did not want to eliminate sacrifices. They didn't want to eliminate anything that was in the Torah. And it's not that faith doesn't matter. Now, after all, if you didn't believe in God, would you keep any of the rituals which undergird Judaism and promote Jewish ethics, right? Dostoevsky said, if there is no God, then all is permitted. So who's to say what's okay and what's not? Faith matters, but because it leads to proper behavior, not because it's the central thing as it is in Christianity.
Well,
Now,
but
if you one more thing, if
Okay.
you take Christianity literally, and I think there are many Christians who do not, when it says Jesus was the Son of God, that's clearly rooted in pagan ideas, where there's a very thin line between the gods and the people. Okay, Sharon, yeah, you had a comment.
well, no, I was just gonna say what my father used to say, which is that Paul took away the need for circumcision, the need to keep kosher, need to put on tefillin. It just made being a Jewish person being a Christian was much easier. And being a
Yeah, all you
member
got to
of-
do is believe.
and a member of
Heresy.
Islam, all you have to do is just submit 5 times a day. That's it. You don't really have to
Yeah.
do much else. I mean,
Mhm.
that's even easier than Christianity.
Oh,
I would
Islam.
disagree with you.
Islam
Respectfully.
is oh, go ahead, Nick.
I would disagree with you respectfully, ma'am. And the reason is because there's 5 pillars in Islam.
Hmm.
And one of them is the Shahada, which is a profession of faith. One is giving charity. One is having the Hajj, going to Mecca if you can. And there's, they do pray 5 times a day. But most Christians that I know, they don't believe that the obligational practice is what saves you. They believe that faith alone. So from my perspective, I think Islam would be more difficult because it's more rigorous like Judaism. I think it's less rigorous than Judaism.
Yeah.
But that's just my experience. So it also
Well,
depends what Christian you ask, because if they're super Orthodox or really old school Catholic, they've got all kinds of stuff to do.
yeah. But yeah, I'm just saying in general that, perhaps Paul was trying to get followers. And when you're trying to convert pagans to a religion that asks a lot of you, I mean, to be circumcised when you're converting as an adult,
Right.
you know.
Your dad was right. I would agree with your father. Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely easier to be Christian, but not only because of circumcision and kashrut and Shabbat and so on and so forth, but also because, you just got to believe. Now, in Christianity today, I find that it often works in a roundabout way, that the people who have faith wind up, tithing to the church. They wind up doing a lot of scripture study, and maybe supporting missions to spread the faith, et cetera, et cetera. But once people start doing things that they know are contrary to the teaching of the church, they distance themselves from the faith. And then they lose the faith because they feel impelled to go in a different direction. And because they don't believe. Islam, in many ways, is we'll come to that when we come to the 7th century, but I'll say at this point that Islam, in many ways, is considered much closer to Judaism than Christianity, partly because, yes, there are certain principles that you're expected to fulfill, and also because it's considered a more pure monotheism than Christianity. There's none of this Father and Son and Holy Ghost business, or even the Father and the Son, right? Muhammad is the prophet. He's not God, but he's a prophet. Yeah, so it preserves a much more pure monotheism than Christianity. It just happens that we live in a time where we happen to get along better with many Christians than we do with many Muslims. Not always true, of course, but frequently. Right? So anyway, I have a lot less to say about Christianity than Telushkin does, not only because he wrote a book, but to me, once you reject the premises, what's there to talk about? Well, there's history, and much of the history of Christianity was premised on the idea of the new covenant, that God had rejected the Jewish people and Christians were now the children of God. So the consequence of that was that it was important that Jews be treated as a rejected people, and that Christians see that the Jews were living in worse conditions, that they were despised, and so on and so forth. Kept alive usually, but not always, but despised, right? And this contributed to the psychology of anti-Semitism, the need for Christians to see Judaism as failed, right? By the way, on this subject, I recommend to you a new book by Dara Horn, Horn, called Dead People Love Jews. People Love Dead Jews. Sorry, to get that title right. People Love Dead Jews, right? It's maybe the most important Jewish book of 2021. She mostly writes fiction, but this is a series of essays, and it is riveting. Highly recommended. The next big event in Jewish history is the revolt against the Romans, which led to the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. The longer the Romans stayed in Judea, the worse it got, the more oppressive the taxes. They took over the appointment of the high priest. So, anyone who cared about the way the temple worked, anyone who cared about Jewish religion as such, saw the high priest as a collaborator with the Romans. Right? And so over the years, there developed a group of rebels who became known as the Zealots. They may have thought of themselves as the Maccabees of their time, except the Romans, as contemptuous of Judaism as they were not as overtly anti-Jewish as Antiochus was. They mainly wanted to stay in charge and milk the Jews for whatever they could get. But they were no more opposed to Judaism than they originally were to the new Christian sect. Rome didn't become Christian until the 4th century. Now, there were some problems when Caligula became the emperor in the year 39 and declared himself to be a god and ordered that his statue should be put up in every temple in the empire. There would eventually, the Jews were not going to put up with that, and there eventually would have been a massacre if Caligula had not been assassinated in 41. By the way, how many of you have seen the PBS production from many years ago, I, Claudius?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you remember that? Yeah. I highly recommend that, unless you're allergic to violence on the screen, because there's no shortage of that. But it's a great, bringing to life of history, at least Roman history, not too much about the Jews in this one. At any rate, the Zealots gained many adherents thanks to Caligula and to various misbehaviors by Roman soldiers. Telushkin suggests that the Zealots were encouraged by the death of Caligula because they said, wow, God is on our side. God killed him. Right? We just have to have faith that God will continue to support us. No, big mistake, right? Rome didn't lose wars, especially to little punks like Judea, right? But the last straw for the Zealots came in the year 66. The Roman governor Florus stole a huge amount of silver from the temple. So they rose up and the Zealots wiped out the Roman garrison in Jerusalem. Well, the Romans had an outpost in Syria, so they sent in a big force from there, and the Zealots knocked them out as well. And tragically, the Zealots believed, because of this, that they could actually beat Rome. So more and more of the Jews were committed to the war. And then the Romans came back with 60,000 of its best troops, far more and far more professional than the Zealots on their best day. And so the Romans started by attacking the Galilee, which was the area that was most supportive of the Zealots. It's estimated that about 100,000 Jews in the Galilee were killed or sold into slavery. Now, the Jews of Jerusalem knew that they couldn't win against the Romans, and it's been suggested by at least one historian that that's why they didn't join the field up in Galilee. They said, this is madness, right? We have no chance against this army, right? But whoever ran off from the Zealots, whoever escaped from the Romans, went to Jerusalem, and they killed all the moderate leaders in Jerusalem. And so it was basically a civil war between the Zealots and the moderates by the time the Romans got to Jerusalem. No wonder the later rabbis declared that the cause of the destruction of Jerusalem was sinat chinam, baseless hatred. Okay? So by the time the whole thing was over and the Romans had battered down the walls and burned the city, at least several 100,000 Jews had died. From that time on until 1948, there was no Jewish political authority in Israel. Telushkin suggests that part of the tragedy of this was that even when Jews were persecuted elsewhere, they couldn't come back to Israel because there was no Jewish state. That wasn't always true. There were some thriving Jewish communities, particularly in the Galilee, after the expulsion from Spain in 1492. Because then Israel was part of the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire had long periods of very pragmatic acceptance of Jewish settlement in Israel. But it was usually true. Telushkin is generally right, with exceptions, that Jews couldn't go back to the land of Israel. Now, before the destruction of Jerusalem, there was one good thing that happened due to the religious leader of the day. And that brings us back to Yochanan ben Zakkai, who is now known as Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. Not only is he a rabbi, because they've been ordaining rabbis now, but he has the title of Rabban, which is like the great rabbi. He's the leading light among all the rabbis in this time, right? When the Romans were coming to Jerusalem, Yochanan ben Zakkai, of course, knew what was coming. And he decided that he had to try to escape Jerusalem in order to preserve Jewish religion and Jewish teachings. The Zealot leadership wouldn't let anybody out. Yochanan ben Zakkai was able to get out by pretending to be sick and then pretending to be dead. Why did that work? Because people didn't do burials inside the city. you had to take the body outside the city for burial. So 2 of his students carry him in a coffin to the gates. And the zealots at the gate let him out because religiously they have to let him out, right? The students take him, they carry him to the cemetery, and then they go back to Jerusalem. Yochanan ben Zakkai gets up and walks to the camp of the Roman general Vespasian. Vespasian is pleased to have the surrender of a Jewish leader. Some sources suggest that that Yochanan ben Zakkai predicted Vespasian would become emperor. Maybe. Vespasian, in any event, offers to grant Yochanan ben Zakkai one wish. A moment that changed Jewish history. Yochanan ben Zakkai says, "Give me the village of Yavne and its sages. Let me establish a place of learning there." So it was. And Telushkin, in one of his most inspired comments, talks about how frustrated Yochanan ben Zakkai must have been seeing so many Jews swept up in the frenzy of resistance and believing that God would punish Rome and destroy its forces like Pharaoh's army crossing the sea. But Yochanan ben Zakkai was not deluded. And one of his most famous teachings says, if you happen to be holding a sapling when they tell you that the Messiah has arrived, first finish planting the sapling and then go greet the Messiah. So when the temple was destroyed, many of the survivors were terribly depressed, but Yochanan ben Zakkai was keeping Judaism alive in this little town of Yavne. And he was building a model of Judaism that would live even after the temple and the Jewish state were destroyed. So I think that marks Yochanan ben Zakkai as one of the great Jewish heroes of all time. Even before the ashes, a new structure was in the works. And when a student was depressed because they could no longer bring sacrifices for atonement, Yochanan ben Zakkai said to his student, "Do not grieve. We have another atonement just as effective, and that is acts of loving kindness." And he quoted a proof text from the prophet Hosea, which says, "For I desire mercy and not sacrifice." So that's the end of independent Judea and the beginning of another chapter in Jewish history. We have just a minute or two for comments or questions.
I think Yochanan ben Zakkai was very brave to do what he did.
Well, sure, they could have, they could have, there's one version of the story that suggests that at the gates of Jerusalem, when his students brought him there, they carried him there to be buried. One of the guards at the gate said, "Let me just make sure that he's dead." And he said, "You can't desecrate the body of our rabbi." And he said, "Oh, I guess not." That could have happened too. Or Vespasian could have said, "Okay, thanks for coming by. See that cross up there? That's for you."
Yeah. Vespasian, I don't know much about the Roman Empire. When you went to
Well, he
rabbinical
did
school,
become emperor.
he did. Was he hyper violent and a lunatic like Caligula was?
No. One of the more moderate emperors, as
So he
I
was
read
okay.
history.
He was more of an administrator than like a total lunatic.
Yeah, he was not the total lunatic. And the one good thing about having a general become president or the emperor, is that you've seen how terrible war is. and you see the price that it takes. You're not as apt to take, to just send the boys off to war if you've had to be there yourself and see what happens.
You're right, Rabbi. I was not in the army, but being in a submarine, I could tell you that we were put in harm's way for different types of missions. And half the time I thought it was completely ridiculous what was going on because I knew the actual intelligence data. And I'm like, this is just absurd. It's political. It's nonsense. It's a waste of time. So I would agree with you as long as the general has a pretty good moral, compass.
Yes, yes. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are off for the next 2 weeks. Jennifer will send you a reminder, but we will next have class on the second Tuesday in January. So hope to see you all then. Thank you all very much.
I'm going to miss you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Well, just
Have a
come to
happy
show,
new
that's all.
year.
Yes,
Happy
Happy New Year
New
to
Year.
everybody.
Yeah,
And
Happy
next
New Year,
year, get
everybody.
rid of what we're in right now.
Yes. Right. And you know how we traditionally, the wish is that, you should live to 120. So I think, for the last 2 years, you should all live to 122 to make up for the last 2 years.
Right.
I like that one.
Okay. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye. Take care, everybody.